The morning sun peeked through the massive windows of the Blackwood mansion, casting long shadows across the marble floors that Elena Rodriguez had been polishing since 5 in the morning. Her back ached as she worked the cloth in small circles, making the white stone gleam under her careful hands. 27 years old, with dark hair always neatly tucked into a practical bun, Elena moved through the mansion like a ghost, seen but rarely acknowledged. This was her life now. 6 days a week, she arrived before dawn to clean the 20-room mansion belonging to Alexander Blackwood, a real estate tycoon whose name appeared on buildings across the city skyline. His world couldn't be more different from the small 2-bedroom apartment Elena shared with her mother and 16-year-old sister, Lucia. "Don't forget to dust the piano room today, Mrs. Winters," the head housekeeper reminded Elena as she passed by with a stack of freshly laundered towels. Mr. Blackwood mentioned he might have guests this weekend. Elena nodded, hiding the small spark of excitement that flared in her chest at the mention of the piano room. It was both her favorite and most painful room to clean in the entire mansion. "I'll do it right after I finish the floors," she promised, keeping her voice neutral. 3 hours later, Elena quietly pushed open the double doors that led into what the staff called the piano room, though its official name was the music conservatory. The space was breathtaking, a vaulted ceiling with hand-painted clouds, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the garden, and in the center, bathed in natural light, stood a magnificent Steinway grand piano. Elena placed her cleaning caddy on the floor by the door and took a moment to simply look at the instrument. It was the finest piano she had ever seen, with its gleaming black surface and ivory keys that seemed to glow in the sunlight. The lid was closed today, as it almost always was. Mr. Blackwood didn't play. The piano was purely for show and occasional entertainment, when he hired musicians for his lavish parties, as she carefully dusted the bookshelves, lined with musical scores that had likely never been opened. Elena allowed herself to imagine, just for a moment, what it would feel like to sit on that bench and place her fingers on those keys. 7 years ago, Elena had been on a very different path. She had earned a full scholarship to the State Conservatory of Music, her talent recognized by professors who believed she could have a future as a concert pianist. Her mother had cried with joy when the acceptance letter arrived. But then life happened. Her father walked out, her mother got sick, and the medical bills piled up faster than they could count them. Elena still remembered the day she had to withdraw from school. "Family comes first," her mother had protested weekly from her hospital bed when Elena told her the decision was already made. But Elena knew there was no other choice. Someone had to work, someone had to take care of Lucia, and someone had to make sure her mother got the treatment she needed. So Elena did what she had to do. She found work cleaning houses for the wealthy, eventually landing the job at the Blackwood mansion, which paid better than most. The grand piano at the conservatory had been replaced by borrowed time on an old upright at the community center, and eventually by a second-hand electronic keyboard tucked in the corner of their small living room. "Dreaming again, Rodriguez?" Elena jumped, nearly knocking over her caddy. Alexander Blackwood stood in the doorway, his tall frame filling the space. At 42, he carried himself with the confidence of someone who had never been told no. His dark hair was perfectly styled, his custom suit without a single wrinkle. Cold blue eyes regarded her with mild amusement. "I'm sorry, Mr. Blackwood, I was just about to dust the piano." Elena quickly grabbed her feather duster, embarrassed to be caught staring. He waved a dismissive hand. "Just make sure it's spotless. I'm having important people over this weekend." He stepped into the room, running a finger along the piano's surface, though Elena knew there wouldn't be a speck of dust. She had cleaned it thoroughly just 2 days ago. "Do you play?" he asked suddenly, catching her off guard. Elena froze. No one at the mansion knew about her past. She had been careful not to mention it, knowing it would only invite questions or worse, pity. "No, sir." She lied, the words tasting bitter on her tongue. "I just think it's beautiful." Alexander nodded absently, already losing interest in the conversation. "Yes, it cost more than you make in 5 years. A Steinway Model D, the same used in concert halls worldwide." He adjusted his gold cufflinks. "The pianist I've hired for Saturday plays with the Philharmonic. Try not to disturb anything when you clean." "Of course, Mr. Blackwood." He turned to leave but paused at the door. "And make sure the floor is polished again before Saturday." I could still see a smudge from last time. Elena waited until his footsteps faded down the hallway before letting out the breath she'd been holding. There hadn't been any smudge. She was meticulous about her work, but arguing with him was pointless. When she was certain she was alone again, Elena approached the piano. Her fingers hovered just inches above the closed lid. She wouldn't dare open it, but sometimes just being near it was enough. She hummed softly, a piece by Chopin she had been working on before everything changed, her fingers moving in the air as if playing invisible keys. "What are you doing?" A sharp voice broke through her daydream. Elena turned to find Mrs. Winters watching her with narrow eyes. The head housekeeper's lips were pressed into a thin line of disapproval. "Just making sure I didn't miss any spots," Elena said quickly, grabbing her cloth and wiping the already clean surface. "Mr. Blackwood doesn't pay you to admire his possessions," Mrs. Winters reminded her. "There are 3 more bathrooms waiting to be cleaned upstairs." "I'm on my way," Elena assured her, gathering her supplies. As she left the room, Elena took one last glance at the piano. In another life, perhaps, she might have been the one hired to play at Mr. Blackwood's party instead of cleaning up after his guests. That evening, Elena returned to the small apartment she shared with her family. The building was old with peeling paint and temperamental plumbing, but they kept it clean and did their best to make it home. The smell of her mother's cooking, beans and rice with a little bit of chicken, filled the small space. "Elena, you're just in time," her mother, Rosa, called from their tiny kitchen. Despite years of illness that had left her too weak for full-time work, Rosa insisted on cooking dinner whenever she had the energy. "Lucia, set the table for your sister." Lucia looked up from her textbook, her eyes tired from studying. At 16, she was already taking advanced classes, determined to earn a scholarship to college. "How was work?" she asked as she placed 3 mismatched plates on their small table. "Same as always," Elena answered with a forced smile, not wanting to burden them with the reality of her day. The backbreaking work, the dismissive attitudes, the constant reminder that she was invisible to people like Alexander Blackwood. After washing up, the 3 women sat down to dinner. It was their ritual to share one good thing that happened during their day. Rosa went first, mentioning that her doctor was pleased with her latest test results. Lucia excitedly told them about acing her chemistry test. When it was Elena's turn, she hesitated. "I got to spend some time in the piano room today," she finally said. The sun was coming through the windows just right, making everything glow. Rosa reached across the table and squeezed her daughter's hand. They never spoke directly about the sacrifice Elena had made, but the understanding was always there, hanging in the air between them. After dinner and dishes, when Lucia had gone back to her studies and her mother was resting, Elena pulled out the worn keyboard from under her bed. She plugged in headphones so as not to disturb anyone and began to play, her fingers finding the keys by memory and muscle even in the dark. For 1 hour each night, this was her escape. Sometimes she played pieces she had memorized years ago. Other times she played by ear songs she had heard on the radio. Tonight she played a piece she had been composing in her head while cleaning the mansion, a melody that spoke of dreams deferred but not forgotten. As she played, Elena closed her eyes and imagined herself sitting at the grand Steinway in the Blackwood mansion, its rich tones filling the room instead of the tinny sound of her cheap keyboard. In these private moments, she allowed herself to remember who she had been before life intervened. Not just Elena the cleaner, but Elena the pianist. The next morning arrived too quickly. Elena was back at the mansion before sunrise, thermos of coffee in hand as she went through her mental checklist for the day. The weekend was approaching, which meant extra work to prepare for Mr. Blackwood's gathering. As she made her way through the quiet house, Elena passed by the piano room again. The door was ajar and she couldn't resist peeking inside. In the pre-dawn light, the piano looked like a sleeping giant. Elena glanced at her watch. She had 20 minutes before anyone else would arrive. Before she could talk herself out of it, she slipped into the room and gently closed the door behind her. Her heart pounded as she approached the piano. This was forbidden, she knew. If caught, she would lose her job immediately. But something pulled her forward, a hunger that couldn't be satisfied by playing her keyboard in the dark. Carefully, so carefully, Elena lifted the lid of the piano and sat down on the bench. She didn't touch the keys yet, just positioned her hands above them, feeling the weight of the moment. Then with a deep breath she allowed herself to press one key, a middle C. The sound resonated through the room, rich and perfect. Tears sprang to her eyes at the beauty of it. How long had it been since she had heard her music on a real piano? Emboldened by that single note, Elena began to play softly, a simple Bach prelude she knew by heart. Her fingers remembered even after all this time, and for just a few minutes, she was transported back to who she used to be. The piece ended too soon. Elena reluctantly closed the lid and stood up, making sure everything was exactly as she had found it. As she turned to leave, she promised herself that this moment, this stolen piece of joy, would be enough to carry her through. Another day of invisible work in a world where people like her were meant to stay in the background. Little did she know that in just a few days, everything would change when Alexander Blackwood would force her to play this very piano, expecting to humiliate her in front of his guests, but instead discovering a talent that had been hidden in plain sight all along. Saturday arrived with a flurry of activity at the Blackwood mansion. Elena had been there since 4 in the morning, working alongside the other staff to prepare for the evening's event. This wasn't just any dinner party. Alexander Blackwood had invited 12 of the most influential business leaders in the city, people whose combined wealth could buy small countries. "Make sure the crystal glasses are spotless," Mrs. Winters instructed, as she inspected Elena's work in the dining room. Mr. Blackwood specifically requested the Waterford set for tonight. Elena nodded, carefully polishing each delicate glass until it sparkled under the chandelier light. Her hands were raw from cleaning products, but she wore thin cotton gloves to protect the expensive tableware from fingerprints. Every detail mattered in the Blackwood household. Especially tonight, through the open doors, Elena could hear voices from the main hall where florists were arranging elaborate centerpieces of white orchids and pale blue hydrangeas. The caterers had arrived early to set up in the kitchen, filling the house with mouth-watering smells that reminded Elena she hadn't eaten since her rushed breakfast at dawn. "Rodriguez," Mrs. Winters called from the doorway. "Once you're done with the glasses, Mr. Blackwood wants the music room checked one last time. The pianist will arrive at 6 for a sound check." "Yes, Mrs. Winters," Elena replied, her pulse quickening at the mention of the music room. She had been careful to avoid it since her stolen moment at the piano days earlier, afraid that somehow Mr. Blackwood would know what she had done. By late afternoon, the mansion had transformed into something from a glossy magazine. Fresh flowers adorned every surface, candles waited to be lit, and the tables were set with fine china and polished silver. Elena had changed into her evening uniform, a plain black dress with a white collar, different from her regular cleaning clothes but still marking her as staff. Her job during the party would be to remain in the background, refilling water glasses and clearing plates between courses. She had done this many times before, and knew how to be efficient without being noticed. In some ways it was easier than her regular cleaning duties. At least she got to hear interesting conversations and see how the other half lived. At 5:30, Elena slipped into the music room for one final check. The grand piano had been moved to the perfect angle, its lid propped open to project sound into the room. Sheet music was arranged neatly on the stand. Debussy, Chopin, and Liszt, according to the titles Elena could see from a distance. Her fingers itched to touch the pages, to play just one of those beautiful pieces, but she restrained herself. Instead, she busied herself with straightening the already perfect chairs arranged for those guests who might want to listen more closely to the music. As she adjusted the last chair, the door opened and Alexander Blackwood strode in, phone pressed to his ear. "What do you mean you can't make it?" His voice was sharp with anger. "The party starts in 2 hours. He paused, listening to the person on the other end. "Food poisoning? Are you sure you can't push through it?" Elena tried to make herself invisible, edging toward the door, but Mr. Blackwood held up a hand, signaling her to stay where she was. "Fine. Fine." He hung up and shoved the phone into his pocket, muttering under his breath. Then he looked at Elena as if seeing her for the first time.
"The pianist is sick."
"Food poisoning, supposedly." "I'm sorry to hear that, sir," Elena said quietly, unsure why he was telling her this. Alexander ran a hand through his perfectly styled hair, a rare sign of agitation. "Victor Chen will be here tonight," he said, more to himself than to Elena. He never misses an opportunity to mention that his parties always feature live music from top performers. The man acts like he single-handedly keeps the arts alive in this city. Elena stood awkwardly, wondering if she should leave. This was the most Mr. Blackwood had ever spoken to her directly, and she wasn't sure what response he expected. "I could call around," she suggested hesitantly. "There might be another pianist available on short notice." Alexander checked his watch and shook his head. "Everyone worth hiring is already booked for Saturday night." He paced across the room, stopping at the piano and resting his hand on its gleaming surface. Suddenly he turned to look at Elena with narrowed eyes. "You," he said slowly. "I've heard you humming sometimes." "Classical pieces." "Chopin, I think." Elena felt her face grow hot. She hadn't realized anyone had noticed. "Just songs I've heard on the radio, sir. Do you play at all?" he asked, his tone making it clear he already knew the answer would be no. After all, why would his cleaning lady know how to play the piano? Elena opened her mouth to deny it again as she had days earlier, but something stopped her. Perhaps it was fatigue from the long day or the way he looked at her, like she was nothing more than another servant with no depth or history worth knowing. "I used to," she admitted quietly. A long time ago, Alexander raised an eyebrow. "Used to? What does that mean exactly?" Elena hesitated, then decided there was no harm in telling him now. "I studied piano for many years. I even had a scholarship to the State Conservatory, but I had to leave before graduating." "A scholarship?" He looked skeptical, as if she were making it up. "Why would you leave?" "Family reasons," Elena said simply, not wanting to share the details of her personal life. Alexander studied her for a long moment, and Elena could almost see the wheels turning in his mind. "How good were you?" I was considered very good," she answered truthfully, remembering her professor's praise and the competitions she had won as a teenager. A strange expression crossed Alexander's face, something between desperation and calculation. "Good enough to play background music at a dinner party?" he asked. Elena's heart began to race. "I haven't played on a real piano in years," she protested. "And I don't have the right clothes for—" "That doesn't matter," Alexander cut her off, moving closer. "You'll play tonight. It wasn't a request." Elena stared at him, trying to process what he was saying. "Sir, I don't think—" "Double pay," he interrupted. "For tonight only. You play background music during cocktails and dinner, and I don't have to listen to Victor Chen smugly offer to have his pianist friend step in." Elena looked at the piano, then back at Alexander. The thought of playing the magnificent Steinway was tempting. So tempting, but not like this. Not as a last resort because the real pianist was sick. "I'm sorry, Mr. Blackwood, but I don't think I can—" "Triple pay," he said firmly. "And if you do well, I might consider helping your sister with college. Mrs. Winters mentioned she's applying next year." Elena's breath caught in her throat. How did he know about Lucia? And how could she refuse an offer that might help secure her sister's future? Still, something about his manner made her uneasy. "Why are you offering this?" she asked, meeting his gaze directly for perhaps the first time since she'd worked for him. Alexander's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Let's just say I'm curious to see if you're as good as you claim to be." That's when Elena understood. He didn't believe her. He thought she was exaggerating her abilities, and he was calling her bluff. Either she would refuse and confirm his suspicion that she had been lying, or she would play poorly and provide him and his guests with some unexpected entertainment. The cleaning lady who thought she could play piano. Elena straightened her shoulders. "What pieces would you like me to play?" If Alexander was surprised by her acceptance, he didn't show it. He gestured to the sheet music on the stand. "These will do for starters. The guests arrive at 7. Be ready." With that, he left the room, already on his phone again, leaving Elena alone with the piano and a churning feeling in her stomach. She walked slowly to the instrument and sat down on the bench, running her fingers lightly over the keys without pressing them. Could she really do this? Play for a room full of wealthy, judgmental people in her maid's uniform? People who would look at her and see nothing but the help? Elena closed her eyes and thought of Lucia, of her dream of college, of a life different from her own. Then she thought of her mother, who had worked so hard all her life and who still believed that Elena would play on a real stage someday. With a deep breath, Elena began to play, softly at first, then with growing confidence as her fingers remembered what to do. The Debussy piece on the stand was one she had known by heart years ago, and somehow her muscles recalled every note. For the next 30 minutes, Elena played through the music, adjusting to the feel of the Steinway, So different from her cheap keyboard at home. By the time Mrs. Winters came looking for her, a worried frown on her face, Elena had made her decision. "There you are. What are you doing at the piano?" Mrs. Winters asked, clearly alarmed. "Mr. Blackwood asked me to play tonight," Elena explained, her voice steadier than she felt. "The pianist is sick." Mrs. Winters looked as if Elena had announced she was flying to the moon. "He asked you to play? For his guests?" "Yes," Elena said simply. "I used to study piano before I started working here." The housekeeper's expression shifted from shock to concern. "Elena, are you sure about this? Mr. Blackwood's friends they're not always kind." "I know," Elena replied, thinking of the way some guests had spoken to her in the past, as if she were invisible or incapable of understanding. But he offered to help with Lucia's college. Understanding dawned on Mrs. Winters' face. "I see." She hesitated, then added, "The guests are starting to arrive. You should get ready." Elena nodded, standing up from the piano bench. As she followed Mrs. Winters out of the room, she caught a glimpse of herself in one of the ornate mirrors on the wall. A young woman in a plain black uniform, her hair in a simple bun, nothing like the elegant pianist who should be entertaining at such an event. For a moment, doubt crept back in. Then she remembered something her first piano teacher had told her. "Music doesn't care what you're wearing or where you come from. It only cares how you play." With those words echoing in her mind, Elena went to prepare for the most important performance of her life, unaware that the evening ahead would change everything, not just for her, but for the tycoon who thought he was setting her up for humiliation. The Blackwood mansion buzzed with conversation as waiters in crisp black uniforms moved smoothly between guests, offering champagne and delicate appetizers on silver trays. Men in expensive suits and women draped in designer dresses and glittering jewelry filled the main hall, their laughter echoing off the high ceilings. Elena stood in a small side room, trying to calm her racing heart. Mrs. Winters had helped her tidy up as best she could, straightening her uniform, lending her a pair of simple pearl earrings, and even finding a bottle of hand cream to soften Elena's work-roughened hands. "You don't have to do this," Mrs. Winters said quietly, adjusting Elena's collar one last time. "I've worked for Mr. Blackwood for 15 years. I could speak to him, tell him it's inappropriate." Elena shook her head. "No, I want to play." And she did, despite her nerves. The thought of touching that beautiful piano again, of letting music flow through her fingers after so long, it called to her like water to someone dying of thirst. A burst of laughter from the main room made Elena flinch. "They're all out there, aren't they? All his important friends." Mrs. Winters squeezed her shoulder. "Just play for yourself, dear. Forget they're even there." Easier said than done, Elena thought as she peered through the doorway. She recognized some of the guests from newspapers and magazines, the CEO of a tech company, a famous architect, the woman who owned half the shopping centers in the city. And there, standing near Alexander Blackwood, was Victor Chen, whose name she had heard mentioned earlier. Unlike the others who seemed caught up in their own importance, Chen had a quieter presence, observing more than speaking. "It's time," Mrs. Winters whispered, nodding toward Alexander, who was now scanning the room with obvious impatience. Taking a deep breath, Elena stepped out from her hiding place and made her way toward him. Conversations paused briefly as people noticed her crossing the room in her maid's uniform. She kept her eyes forward, ignoring the curious glances. "Ah, there she is," Alexander said as she approached, his voice carrying just enough to draw attention. "Everyone, a slight change of plans. Our pianist called in sick, but fortunately Elena here has offered to fill in." The way he said it made it clear this was an amusing development, not a serious musical arrangement. A few guests exchanged knowing smiles. Victor Chen raised an eyebrow but said nothing. "She assures me she's quite accomplished," Alexander continued with the faintest hint of mockery in his tone. "Studied at the conservatory apparently before joining my household staff." Heat rose in Elena's cheeks, but she kept her expression neutral. This was exactly what she had expected. He was setting her up for humiliation, presenting her as a punchline before she'd played a single note. "The piano's ready for you," Alexander said, gesturing toward the music room where the doors had been opened wide so the music would carry throughout the main hall, perhaps something light to begin with. "I wouldn't want you to strain yourself," several guests chuckled. Elena nodded stiffly and walked toward the piano, feeling dozens of eyes on her back. As she entered the music room, she noticed a few guests had followed, perhaps curious to witness what they expected would be an awkward performance. The Steinway waited for her, its lid fully open now, gleaming under the soft lighting. Elena sat down on the bench, adjusted its height, and placed her hands in her lap for a moment, gathering her thoughts. The sheet music Alexander had left was still there, safe. Predictable pieces that wouldn't challenge or offend anyone. Elena pushed it aside. If she was going to do this, she would play what moved her, not what would simply fade into the background of wealthy people's conversations. She closed her eyes briefly, deciding what to play first. Then, without announcement or fanfare, she began. Her fingers touched the keys, and Chopin's Nocturne No. 20 in C-sharp minor filled the room. It started softly, almost tentatively, like a question being asked. Elena kept her eyes on her hands, not daring to look at the faces of those watching. She didn't need to. She could feel the shift in the room, the slight pause in conversations, the turning of heads. The piece built, gradually growing in confidence and emotion. Elena felt herself disappearing into the music, the way she used to years ago when nothing existed but the notes and the feelings they carried. Her body swayed slightly as her hands moved across the keys, muscle memory taking over where conscious thought left off. The final notes of the nocturne faded, leaving a moment of complete silence. Elena still didn't look up, afraid of what she might see on the faces of the guests. Without pausing, she moved directly into Debussy's Clair de Lune, its dreamy, impressionistic tones washing over the room like moonlight on water. By now, the silence in the adjoining hall told her that people were listening, really listening, not just hearing background music while they chatted. As she played the familiar rises and falls of the piece, Elena finally allowed herself to glance up. The doorway to the music room was crowded now. At least 20 people had gathered to watch, their expressions no longer amused or condescending but surprised, even moved. Victor Chen had come closest, standing just a few feet away, his eyes closed as he listened. And there at the back of the group stood Alexander Blackwood. His face had lost its smug smile, replaced by something Elena couldn't quite read. Confusion? Disbelief? His eyes were fixed on her hands as they danced across the keyboard. The final chords of Clair de Lune resonated through the room, and this time when the music stopped, there was a heartbeat of absolute silence before applause broke out. Not polite, obligatory clapping, but genuine, enthusiastic appreciation. Elena's hands trembled slightly as she rested them in her lap. She hadn't expected applause. She hadn't expected anything except perhaps toleration or at worst ridicule. Extraordinary, said a voice close to her. Victor Chen had stepped forward, his expression warm with admiration. Truly extraordinary. Would you play something else for us? Perhaps some Liszt? Elena looked uncertainly toward Alexander, whose face had now composed itself into a careful mask of neutrality. He gave a small nod and she turned back to the piano. For the next hour, Elena played piece after piece, some from memory, others from the sheet music provided. She played Liszt's Liebestraum, Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata, and even at one guest's request, a challenging Rachmaninoff prelude that she had practiced obsessively during her conservatory days. The party had completely transformed. Instead of mingling and networking, most guests had found places to sit or stand in and around the music room, glasses of champagne forgotten in their hands as they listened. A few closed their eyes, transported by the music. Others watched Elena's hands with fascination, as if trying to understand how the woman who had probably served them drinks at previous gatherings could create such beauty. When Elena finally stopped, her fingers aching pleasantly from the unaccustomed workout, the applause was immediate and prolonged. People she had served for years without receiving so much as a glance were now looking at her with respect, even awe. Victor Chen approached the piano again. May I ask where you studied? His tone was different from Alexander's earlier, genuinely curious rather than skeptical. The State Conservatory, Elena answered, her voice slightly hoarse from nervousness. I had a scholarship, but I had to leave in my second year. A tragedy for the music world, Chen said, shaking his head. Your technique is remarkable, especially considering you haven't had formal training in... How long? 7 years, Elena admitted. A murmur ran through the listeners. 7 years without proper instruction, likely without regular access to a good instrument, and she could still play like that? And you work here as... Chen left the question hanging delicately. I clean the house, Elena said simply, lifting her chin slightly. She wasn't ashamed of her work, even if others might look down on it. Another murmur, this one tinged with discomfort. A few guests glanced away, perhaps remembering times they had treated her as invisible. Alexander finally stepped forward, his composure regained. Well, this has certainly been an unexpected treat, he said smoothly. But I believe dinner is ready to be served. Elena, thank you for your performance. The way he said performance made it clear he was trying to wrap things up, to return the evening to its intended course. But Victor Chen wasn't finished. I'm on the board of the National Conservatory, he said, addressing Elena directly. We have a special program for exceptional talents who had to interrupt their studies due to financial hardship. I'd like to give you my card, if I may. He reached into his pocket and handed her a sleek business card. Elena took it with slightly shaking hands, unable to believe what was happening. Call my office on Monday, Chen continued. We should discuss your future as a pianist, not as a cleaner. Elena looked down at the card, then back up at Chen's kind face. Thank you, she managed to say, her voice barely above a whisper. I will. The guests began to move toward the dining room, many pausing to compliment Elena as they passed. She remained seated at the piano, overwhelmed by the sudden turn of events, the card clutched tightly in her hand like a lifeline. As the room emptied, she finally dared to look at Alexander Blackwood. He stood near the door, watching her with an unreadable expression. Their eyes met across the room, hers still bright with the thrill of playing, his dark with... Was it anger? Embarrassment? For a moment, neither spoke. Then Alexander turned and walked away without a word, leaving Elena alone with the piano and the lingering echoes of her music in the air. What had started as an attempt to humiliate her had instead revealed her true self to the world. For the first time in 7 years, Elena felt like herself again. Not just a cleaner, not just someone who took care of others, but Elena the pianist. The woman who could make a room full of wealthy, powerful people fall silent with the touch of her fingers on piano keys. As she finally rose from the bench, she realized her hands were no longer trembling. Whatever happened next, she had survived this night with her dignity and talent intact. More than survived. She had triumphed. The dinner party continued in the grand dining room, but something had shifted in the atmosphere. Elena stood in the kitchen, helping to prepare the dessert trays while the other staff whispered about what had happened. Word had spread quickly. The cleaner who played like a concert pianist, the stunned silence of the guests, Victor Chen's offer. Is it true he gave you his card? Asked Mia, one of the younger servers, her eyes wide with excitement. Elena nodded, touching the pocket of her uniform where she had carefully tucked the business card. It felt like a dream, one she might wake from at any moment. Mr. Chen is on the board of the National Conservatory, said Carlos, the head waiter who had worked high-end parties for decades. If he's interested in you, it's serious. I've seen him at events for years. He doesn't make empty gestures. Mrs. Winters appeared in the doorway, her expression a mix of pride and concern. Elena, Mr. Blackwood wants you to play again after dinner. Coffee will be served in the music room. A ripple of excitement went through the kitchen staff, but Elena felt a flutter of unease. She had seen Alexander's face after her performance, that cold, unreadable look. Why would he want her to play again? Was he planning some other form of humiliation to reassert his control? Did he seem angry? She asked quietly. Mrs. Winters hesitated. Not angry exactly, but not pleased either. Be careful, Elena. Remember who signs your paychecks. The warning was unnecessary. Elena knew all too well the precarious nature of her position. Despite the triumph of her performance, she was still the cleaner, still dependent on this job to support her family. When the dinner plates had been cleared and the guests began moving toward the music room, Elena took a moment to step outside through the kitchen door. The night air was cool against her flushed skin. She closed her eyes and took several deep breaths, trying to prepare herself for whatever came next. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. A text from Lucia. How's the fancy party? Boring as usual? Elena smiled, imagining how her sister would react when she told her about tonight. But that would have to wait. She slipped the phone back into her pocket and returned inside, making her way to the music room. The guests had arranged themselves more formally this time, taking seats around the piano as if at a recital. A few nodded to Elena as she entered, acknowledgement she had never received before. Victor Chen gave her an encouraging smile from his seat near the front. Alexander stood by the fireplace, swirling a glass of brandy. His eyes met Elena's briefly before he addressed the room. "Ladies and gentlemen, Elena has agreed to favor us with a few more pieces before the evening concludes." His tone was polite but distant, as if introducing a stranger. Elena moved to the piano, hyper-aware of the expectant silence. This time there was no background chatter, no pretense that she was providing mere ambient music. They were waiting, really waiting to hear her play. As she sat down, she noticed that someone had placed a different set of sheet music on the stand. More challenging pieces, including Chopin's Revolutionary Etude, a technically demanding work that even conservatory students approached with caution. She glanced up at Alexander, who was watching her with a faint smile that didn't reach his eyes. It was a test, she realized. He was hoping she would falter, that the first performance had been some kind of fluke. Without a word, Elena set aside the new music and played from memory instead. She chose Chopin again, but this time his Ballad No. 1 in G minor, a piece that told a story through its music, beginning gently before building to a passionate, almost violent intensity. It was a piece about struggle and transformation, about beauty emerging from darkness. As she played, Elena poured everything into the music, her years of working hands raw for minimal pay, the dreams she had set aside, the love for her family that had made it all worthwhile, and the spark of hope that had never quite died within her. Her fingers flew across the keys during the difficult runs, never faltering, finding strength she didn't know she still possessed. When the final chords resonated through the room, there was that perfect moment of silence again, the highest compliment a musician can receive before the applause began. This time it wasn't just polite appreciation, but genuine admiration. With several guests rising to their feet, Elena looked up to find Alexander watching her, his expression now troubled, almost confused, as if seeing something he couldn't quite comprehend. When their eyes met, he looked away first. Victor Chen approached the piano as the applause faded. "Magnificent," he said warmly. "The ballade is notoriously difficult, yet you played it with such emotion, such control." "Thank you," Elena said, still catching her breath from the exertion of the piece. "I have a proposition for you," Chen continued, glancing briefly at Alexander. "The conservatory is hosting a special concert next month. Talented musicians who have overcome significant obstacles. Would you consider performing?" Elena's heart leaped. A real concert on a real stage. I would need to practice," she stammered. "I don't have regular access to a piano except—" "You can use mine," interrupted a female voice. A well-dressed woman Elena recognized as the owner of a local art gallery stepped forward. "I have a baby grand that barely gets touched these days. You're welcome to practice there whenever you'd like." Before Elena could respond, another guest spoke up. "I'm on the scholarship committee at the conservatory. We should discuss continuing your education where you left off." It was happening too fast. Elena looked around the room, overwhelmed by the sudden attention and offers from people who, just hours ago, wouldn't have given her a second glance. "I think that's enough for tonight." Alexander's voice cut through the buzz of conversation. "It's getting late, and I'm sure Elena has her regular duties to attend to in the morning." The reminder of her position, her real position in this house, fell like a cold shadow over the warm glow of the evening. The guests quieted, suddenly uncomfortable with the disparity between their excitement over her talent and the reality of her situation. Victor Chen frowned slightly but nodded. "Of course. Elena, please do call my office on Monday. We have much to discuss." He turned to Alexander. "Thank you for an illuminating evening, Blackwood. Quite unlike any dinner party I've attended before." The guests began to say their goodbyes, several pausing to speak quietly to Elena, pressing business cards into her hand or making offers of support. Within 30 minutes, the house had emptied except for the staff bustling about with cleanup. Elena remained in the music room, her fingers still resting lightly on the piano keys, unable to quite let go of the instrument that had changed everything in a single evening. "You should head home," Mrs. Winters said gently from the doorway. "It's past midnight. I'll make sure everything gets put away properly." Elena nodded, reluctantly rising from the bench. "Did you hear them? They want me to play in a concert." "At the conservatory," Mrs. Winters smiled. "I heard. And they'd be lucky to have you." Her expression grew more serious. But Elena, be careful with Mr. Blackwood. He doesn't like surprises, and he certainly doesn't like being upstaged in his own home. I didn't mean to upstage him, Elena protested. He's the one who made me play. Yes, but he expected you to play poorly, or at least modestly. He didn't expect what happened. Mrs. Winters glanced toward the hallway. He's in his study now. Has been since the last guest left. Drinking alone. Elena felt a pang of something unexpected. Not quite guilt, but a strange sense of connection to the man whose attempt to humiliate her had instead set her free. Should I speak to him before I leave? Mrs. Winters shook her head firmly. Not tonight. Give him time to process what happened. Tomorrow will be soon enough. Elena gathered her few belongings and slipped out through the staff entrance. The night was clear and cool, stars visible despite the city lights. She stood for a moment looking up at them, feeling as if she were seeing the world differently, as if she herself were different from the woman who had arrived at work that morning. Her phone buzzed again. Another text from Lucia, wondering why she wasn't home yet. Elena began the long walk to the bus stop, her mind replaying the events of the evening. By the time she reached the apartment, both her mother and sister would be asleep. She would have to wait until morning to share her news. As she walked, Elena became aware of a black car moving slowly beside her. The window rolled down, revealing Alexander Blackwood in the driver's seat. Get in, he said, his voice flat. I'll drive you home. Elena hesitated, remembering Mrs. Winters's warning. It's late, it's dark, and the buses run every hour at this time of night. Alexander continued, impatient. Just get in the car, Elena. Something in his tone, the use of her first name perhaps, or the lack of the cold mockery from earlier, made her open the passenger door and slide into the seat beside him. The car was warm and smelled of expensive leather. They drove in silence for several blocks. You never told me, Alexander finally said, his eyes on the road. All this time you never mentioned you could play like that. You never asked, Elena replied simply. And would it have mattered if I had told you? Alexander's hands tightened on the steering wheel. Where do you live? Elena gave him directions to her apartment building in the old industrial district, bracing herself for his reaction. When they pulled up outside the rundown complex, security lights flickering dimly over the entrance, Alexander said nothing, but his jaw tightened visibly. Thank you for the ride, Elena said, reaching for the door handle. Wait. Alexander turned to face her fully for the first time. In the dim light of the car, his expression was hard to read. What Chen offered you tonight, are you going to take it? Elena met his gaze steadily. Yes, I think I am. He nodded slowly, as if her answer confirmed something for him. And the cleaning job? I still need to work, she said. At least until I know what's possible with music. Alexander looked past her at the apartment building, then back at her face. Something shifted in his expression. A crack in the cold facade he had maintained all evening. I didn't know, he said quietly. When I asked you to play, I didn't know you could. That I would what, Mr. Blackwood? Embarrass you by being better than you expected? The words came out sharper than she had intended. He didn't answer immediately. And in that silence, Elena realized what it had cost this proud man to drive her home, to sit outside her shabby apartment building, to face the reality of the life lived by someone he had treated as nothing more than a convenience. Good night, Mr. Blackwood, she said more gently this time. I'll see you on Monday as usual. As she stepped out of the car, Alexander spoke again. It won't be as usual, Elena. Nothing will be as usual again. She closed the door and watched as his car pulled away into the night, wondering what he had meant and why, despite everything, she felt that strange connection to him again, as if their lives had become entangled in ways neither of them had expected when the day began. Elena didn't sleep that night. She sat at the small kitchen table in the apartment, a cup of tea growing cold between her hands as she stared at the pile of business cards spread before her. Victor Chen's was on top, embossed with gold lettering, heavy and expensive between her fingers when she picked it up again. Her mother found her there at dawn, still in her uniform, eyes red from exhaustion but bright with something Rosa hadn't seen in years, hope. What happened? Rosa asked, immediately sensing that something significant had changed. Elena told her everything. The failed attempt at humiliation, the performance that had silenced the room, the offers that had followed, and the strange, tense drive home with Alexander Blackwood. Rosa listened without interrupting, tears gathering in her eyes. When Elena finished, her mother reached across the table and took her hands. "Your father would be so proud," she said softly.
"He always said you were meant for more than cleaning houses." "I'm still a cleaner, Mama," Elena reminded her.
"At least for now. One performance doesn't change everything." "No," Rosa agreed. "But it's a beginning." By the time Lucia woke up, Elena had showered and changed, though she still hadn't slept. She told her story again, smiling as her sister's eyes grew wider with each detail. "So you're going to be a famous pianist now?" Lucia asked, half joking, half serious. "I'm going to call Mr. Chen on Monday," Elena said, "and the woman from the gallery about using her piano to practice. But I'm also going to work. We still need the money." Sunday passed in a blur of excitement and preparation. Elena dug out her old music books from the closet, pages worn and marked with notes from professors long ago. She practiced finger exercises on the tabletop, trying to build back strength and flexibility. Her mother made her favorite foods, treating the day like a celebration, while Lucia looked up Victor Chen online, reading aloud articles about his contributions to the arts. Monday morning came too quickly. Elena dressed for work as usual, though she slipped Victor Chen's card and a small notebook into her pocket. She would call him during her lunch break, she decided. The bus ride to the Blackwood mansion felt different somehow, as if she were traveling to a new place rather than the house she had cleaned 6 days a week for the past 3 years. As she walked up the long driveway, Elena wondered what reception awaited her. Would Alexander act as if nothing had happened? Would he be cold, even hostile, after being shown up in front of his peers? Mrs. Winters met her at the staff entrance, her expression unreadable. "Good morning, Elena. Mr. Blackwood wants to see you in his study right away." Elena's stomach tightened. Was she being fired? It wouldn't be the first time a wealthy employer had let someone go for the crime of outshining them. "Should I change first?" she asked, gesturing to her coat and street clothes. Mrs. Winters shook her head. He was quite clear right away. The walk to Alexander's study seemed longer than usual. Elena paused outside the heavy oak door, took a deep breath, and knocked. "Come in," called the familiar voice. Alexander Blackwood sat behind his massive desk, dressed impeccably as always in a tailored suit. He looked tired, Elena thought. There were shadows under his eyes that hadn't been there before. Papers were spread across the desk, along with a laptop open to what looked like a spreadsheet. "Good morning, Mr. Blackwood," Elena said, standing just inside the door. "Sit down, please," he replied, gesturing to the chair across from him. Elena sat, folding her hands in her lap to keep them from fidgeting. Whatever was coming, she would face it with dignity. Alexander studied her for a long moment before speaking. "Have you called Chen yet?" The question surprised her. "No, sir. I was planning to during my lunch break." He nodded as if her answer confirmed something. "And the others? The gallery owner, the scholarship committee member?" "Not yet." Alexander leaned back in his chair. "Before you do, I have a proposition for you." Here it comes, Elena thought. He's going to try to stop me somehow. "Offer me more money to keep cleaning and forget about music." "I've been up most of the night," Alexander continued, running a hand through his hair, a rare gesture of dishevelment from such a controlled man. "What happened Saturday night? It made me realize some things I'm not particularly proud of." Elena remained silent, waiting. "I thought I knew you," he said. 3 years of you working in my house, and I thought I knew exactly who you were. Just the cleaner, someone whose name I barely remembered most days." He met her eyes directly. "I was wrong." The admission hung in the air between them. Elena hadn't expected this. Not an apology exactly, but an acknowledgement. "When I asked you to play, it was cruel," Alexander continued. "I wanted to embarrass you, to put you in your place. Instead," he shook his head slightly, "instead you showed everyone, including me, exactly what you're capable of. And it made me wonder how many other Elenas there are out there, people with extraordinary talent and no way to develop it because of circumstances beyond their control." He pushed a folder across the desk toward her. "I've drawn up plans for a foundation, the Blackwood Arts Initiative. Its purpose would be to identify and support artists from disadvantaged backgrounds, musicians, painters, dancers, writers, people who might otherwise never get the chance to share their gifts with the world." Elena opened the folder cautiously. Inside were preliminary documents for a non-profit organization, with an initial funding pledge that made her eyes widen. "Why are you showing me this?" she asked. "Because I want you to be the first recipient," Alexander said. "Full tuition to complete your degree at the conservatory. A stipend for living expenses so you don't have to clean houses while you study. And," he hesitated, "I'd like you to help shape the foundation, to be part of its advisory board once you've completed your education." Elena stared at him, trying to understand the transformation that had occurred in this man over a single weekend. "Why?" she asked again. "Why would you do this?" Alexander was quiet for a moment. "Because talent like yours shouldn't be scrubbing floors," he finally said. "And because I need to be reminded regularly not to judge people by their circumstances." Elena closed the folder slowly. "And if I say no? If I prefer Mr. Chen's offer?" "Then take it with my blessing," Alexander said, surprising her again. "This isn't about controlling you, Elena. It's about making something right." She studied his face, looking for signs of the manipulative employer she had known for years. What she saw instead was something she had never expected: genuine regret and perhaps a desire for redemption. "I need to think about it," she said. "And discuss it with my family." Alexander nodded. "Of course. Take all the time you need." He glanced at his watch. "In the meantime, I've arranged for you to have the day off. There's a car waiting outside to take you to the gallery. Mrs. Torres is expecting you. She's cleared her schedule so you can practice on her piano today." Elena stood up, feeling slightly off balance by this unexpected turn of events. "Thank you," she said simply. As she turned to leave, Alexander spoke again. "Elena?" She paused at the door. "I heard you that morning," he said quietly. "About a week ago. I was working early in my home office and heard someone playing the piano. Just a few notes at first, then a Bach prelude. It was beautiful. I knew then that you could play, but I didn't say anything. I should have." Elena felt a flush of embarrassment at being caught in her secret moment at the piano. "It was wrong of me to touch it without permission." "No," Alexander shook his head. "What's wrong is that you felt you had to hide your talent. That stops now." 2 years passed in what felt like both a moment and a lifetime. Elena completed her degree at the conservatory, studying with professors who pushed her to reach her full potential. The Blackwood Arts Initiative funded her education as promised, along with those of 17 other artists during its first 2 years of operation. Elena kept her promise too, joining the foundation's board once she graduated. Her unique perspective, someone who had lived on both sides of privilege, proved invaluable in identifying deserving candidates and structuring programs that actually worked. Her family's life transformed alongside her own. They moved to a comfortable apartment closer to the conservatory. Rosa's health improved with access to better medical care, and Lucia won a science scholarship to university, her own path now unhindered by financial concerns. Alexander Blackwood changed as well. The cold, demanding employer gradually became someone different, still driven and occasionally difficult, but more aware of the humanity of those around him. He and Elena developed an unusual friendship, built on mutual respect that had been hard-won on both sides. On a crisp autumn evening, Elena stood backstage at the city's most prestigious concert hall, trying to calm her racing heart. Tonight was her debut as a soloist with the Philharmonic, a dream so distant 2 years ago that she had stopped allowing herself to even imagine it. She peered through the curtain at the packed auditorium. In the front row sat her mother and sister, dressed in their finest, faces shining with pride. Beside them was Mrs. Winters, who had become a close family friend. Victor Chen was there too, now her mentor and champion in the classical music world. And in the seat at the end of the row, somewhat apart from the others, sat Alexander Blackwood. He came to every one of her performances, always sitting in the same position, close enough to see clearly but slightly removed, as if still conscious of the boundaries between their worlds. A stagehand signaled that it was time. Elena smoothed the fabric of her concert gown, midnight blue silk that caught the light as she moved, and walked onto the stage. The applause washed over her as she bowed, first to the audience, then to the conductor and orchestra. As she took her place at the magnificent grand piano at center stage, Elena caught Alexander's eye for just a moment. He gave her a small nod, not the condescending gesture of an employer to a servant, but the acknowledgement of one artist to another, one human being to another. Elena placed her fingers on the keys and began to play Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2, a piece about darkness and light, about falling and rising again. As the music filled the hall, she thought about the journey that had brought her here. From cleaning floors in a mansion to commanding a stage before thousands, she played not just for herself but for her family, for others like her whose talents lay hidden by circumstance, and yes, even for Alexander Blackwood, the tycoon who had tried to shame her but instead had set her free, and in doing so, had found something of his own humanity along the way. The music soared, and with it, the understanding that sometimes life's most difficult moments can lead to its most beautiful transformations.